Vector Control District. Orange County Mosquito and Vector Control District is interesting in that we provide service to all areas of Orange County. We operate independently of the County Board of Supervisors, which means our agency is governed by a 35-member Board of Trustee, 34 members from each city in Orange County, and one from the county at large. And our agency is funded by an assessed value on each parcel of land. And so there's almost 1 million parcels of land in Orange County, and more or less residential parcels pay around, I believe it is $9 through 2 benefit assessments a year annually for our services. The mission of the Orange County Mosquito and Vector Control District is to educate and protect Orange County residents, lands, other species of importance from vectors, and also prevent vector-borne diseases in an environmentally and responsible manner. And so our agency Board of Trustees has voted to provide that our agency will provide service for mosquitoes, fire ants, rats, fleas, ticks, although it's mainly surveillance, and also filth flies. And so the types of vectors that vector control districts provide service for can change depending on what is voted in by the Board of Trustees. But I would like to stress that the majority of our agency's work is devoted against controlling mosquitoes. And our agency, we have, I believe it's 63 full-time employees, and then we easily double our size by hiring seasonal employees to assist with operations in the summertime. And our employees carry badges. They are enforcing codes related to mosquitoes and vectors, and through using powers provided to the agency through the California Health and Safety Code Mosquito Abatement Act, which we here in California, California was the second state to incorporate mosquito control regulations. The first state was the state of New Jersey. And so the original Mosquito Abatement Act was put into place in 1915 with the goal of reducing the incidence of malaria mosquitoes. And at least in Southern California, we have not had a locally transmitted case of malaria since 1991. So the programs have been widely considered effective. And the reason for vector control, I'm choosing to start with this brief intro today just for the group because it's kind of hard to really grasp what the role of vector control is when dealing with vector problems that are really only on a single property. And so I'm just going to spend a few minutes discussing this, which is that the role of vector control, why these agencies exist, is because individual protection against vector-borne diseases is only considered partially effective. So if you're looking at this map here of Orange County in an area around northern Orange County that's very dense, and you're a homeowner and you're experiencing a mosquito issue at your property, and like let's say that white bar represents the single property, can you effectively control mosquitoes if the home range of a mosquito is much larger? So they could be coming from other people's properties. And so that really is the role of vector control, is to make judgment calls regarding the types of insects or vectors that are coming off of property and just determining whether or not there is a risk to surrounding neighbors. And the code also allows the mosquito and vector control districts, it says specifically that we can conduct surveillance programs and studies of vectors and vector-borne diseases within the area that we provide the service, and also in any areas where mosquitoes or vectors could be produced and then enter into our area. So it is a broad authority to address mosquito and vector control issues. And the codes also state that mosquito and vector control districts are to take any and all actions to abate or control vectors and vector-borne diseases. And so I'm going to be putting some links in the chat following my presentation with links to, at least if anyone's interested, how vector controls operate. Our district, we have won Transparency Awards, and we have the plans listed online, and you're able to review our integrated vector management plan, our disease response plan, and the protocols and procedures that we use to get compliance from residents when it comes to producing vectors. But I'd like to also say that really vector control, although we have lots of broad authority provided by state codes, we are not exempt from the Fourth Amendment. And so vector control inspectors are not just able to enter onto private property without landowner consent. The Health and Safety Code is very clear. Vector problems that are being produced on land are the responsibility of the property owner. However, the property owner also has other rights. And so our vector control agency, we have to ask permission to control certain vectors on certain private properties. And if permission is not granted, then we have to go to a judge and get a warrant. And so much of the district's activities are not related to getting warrants. We're hoping to, through the shared responsibility of vector control, help people to make changes to comply with recommendations that we're giving them. So in reality, very few cases end up moving forward to formal abatement or public nuisance. That said, very few cases also receive warrants for inspections. And so that's one of the main limitations of mosquito and vector control districts, especially when dealing with organisms like brown dog ticks, which are primarily associated with dogs in people's backyards. And so although mosquito and vector control have broad authority to conduct our outreach and education programs, we do have limitations, and many of that comes back down to property rights. And because control of vectors is permission-based, that means that the backyard is really a difficult place to sometimes get permission to enter. But through, as I mentioned, our agency, we have links to our response plans, and you can see the types of diseases our agency responds to, how we accomplish that, and what kind of warrants we use for accessing difficult to access properties. But I would also like to say that we do have a memorandum of understanding vector control districts, almost all of them do, with their local healthcare agency, so that we're able to receive information about disease cases or disease concerns, and able to where all of our employees are HIPAA trained, we're able then to investigate cases of disease in the community, with the goal being, of course, to reduce the risk of the diseases from it potentially impacting others. And I used the term throughout the presentation of area-wide. And so area-wide means strategies that are not just limited to the individual property, which is producing, in this case, many ticks, but also what are the strategies to address all of the properties that may be impacted by these ticks. And that includes developing IVM plans and responses, conducting surveillance for infectious agents, determining the target area that the interventions will be conducted in, and then notifying impacted communities about the intervention, and also the local city jurisdiction or neighborhood council, and as well as outreach to local animal care agencies and shelters about risks of ticks or risks of these vectors. And then, of course, distribution of topical flea or tick control medication, or distribution of control, meaning we send technicians directly to the neighborhood to conduct control activities in the targeted area, with the goal of course, reducing tick abundance. And so a lot of times with public health agencies, these area-wide strategies for, flea and tick disease prevention, these take into consideration these limitations of accessing the front or backyard, or maybe the ticks don't have disease. Are they really a problem, or are they just a nuisance? Like, disease needs to be present. What if a city doesn't want us to be operating in their local median? Or what if a city worker is someone that's impacted by the ticks? And so all of these considerations go into making and adjusting these area-wide strategies for um, flea or tick prevention. And the reason why, I'll just add that a lot of my slides contain fleas, is because in Orange County, we have to deal with the disease called flea-borne typhus, and flea-borne typhus, very similar to brown dog tip type issues, which is it can be related to homeowners who have conditions conducive to the disease on their property, whether that's dogs chained up and tied up outside with fleas, or maybe feeding a large cat colony of cats in their backyard. And so our agency has also done a lot of work on how to educate communities about flea um, control and disease prevention of flea-borne typhus. And I'm so thankful for so many wonderful, amazing IPM researchers in our communities. And I really enjoy um, reading various papers about various area-wide strategies for flea and tick prevention. But overall, area-wide strategies are considered strategies that use various control tactics against an entire pest population within a geographical area to achieve economic control. And economic control is really hard in public health because, you know, when you're selling a food item like in agriculture, it's a clear monetary value, where past that value, you're going to lose money on your crops. But when it comes to people and human lives, uh, the triggers end up becoming much lower. And at least in a lot of things that we've seen over time in Orange County, is when humans' health's involved, people really don't want you to say, "Oh yeah, we'll slide with 150 brown dog ticks in your neighborhood." That's okay for us. They want you to say they want more concern. They're going to demand more service for the taxes that they're paying from our agency. And so economic control it's challenging. It's hard to talk about sometimes when we're talking about some of these pests. But other researchers around the country have defined strategies that can be used for controlling ticks. And so basically there's four main strategies, if you want to get control of ticks or tick-borne diseases. The first seems obvious, which would be to reduce the flea or the tick density. And so that's one potential strategy, is to control fleas or ticks in an area. But that can be challenging if you're not able to get in the backyard, or a homeowner doesn't want to open a door, or maybe they don't want you to access their pet. So reducing flea and tick density can become very challenging. The second potential strategy would be to lower the prevalence of the infection of disease organism in the flea or in the tick. And so what's challenging specifically about brown dog ticks and Rocky Mountain spotted fever is incidence of Rocky Mountain spotted fever and brown dog ticks is very low. It is high, as we'll learn today, in other areas and in certain areas, but overall, every brown dog tick our agency has ever tested, which is over 1,000, has tested negative for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. However, sometimes you might have a high prevalence of disease and it's easier to bring it lower, or sometimes you might have a really low prevalence of disease, but it may or may not be zero. And so it would be even more difficult to lower an already low prevalence of disease in ticks. Now, the third strategy for addressing ticks area-wide would be to modify human behavior to reduce exposure to fleas and ticks. But modifying human behavior is also very difficult. If people actually modified their behavior, just imagine, at least for vector-borne disease, we shouldn't have mosquito problems. We shouldn't have a lot of things if people actually took care of their properties, turned out water, or in the case of rats, right? If people actually picked up the old fruit or the fallen fruit from their trees and disposed of it instead of leaving it on the ground. So modifying human behavior, yes, it's a strategy. Is it effective? That's kind of another question. And then the fourth strategy would be vaccination of humans or host animals. And currently, there is no vaccination. I mean, there's not even vaccination for Lyme disease, right? So there's not going to be vaccination for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. At least I'm not aware of that at this time. And because brown dog ticks are associated with dogs, um, and because many of those dogs can be strays, it's just another challenging aspect is to get flea or tick control on stray dogs, which are running around tribal lands or possibly in northern Mexico. These are large areas of desert land where dogs are roaming. And so a lot of this can be very difficult to imagine how that program could be effective. And so what we see is since we don't have, there is no option of vaccinating humans or host animals for ticks. There's really not an option for lowering the prevalence of infection of disease in fleas or ticks. And so, that really leaves us with this reducing flea and tick density as a strategy, and then also modifying human behavior to reduce exposure to fleas and ticks. And so these are all things to take into consideration because I understand that it seems like everything, these public education prevention programs should be more impactful and be more effective, but there's many constraints that can lead to why that is not so. And I published some paper about our district's use of area-wide strategies for controlling fleas and flea-borne typhus. In 2023, there's a link, I'll provide this after, to that article. And for the majority of my presentation today, I'm going to be referencing two papers. One, and both of these are available open access online, and I'm going to tell you this, Don Torres' Biology and Ecology of the Brown Dog Tick has some amazing videos, which are linked to the paper. And so if you want to check those out, I would say it's worth it to find the paper. And then this second paper is from University of Florida, and it's like a deep dive in brown dog ticks. And so I've noted throughout the presentation where I've borrowed and quoted from these two important sources. So, as I'm assuming all of us are familiar with, the ticks have different life stages. There's the egg stage, which is not on this person's finger, and then the tick hatches from the egg stage and becomes a larvae. And larval ticks have 6 legs. And then the tick is required to take a blood meal, and then it will shed its skin and it will grow in another pair of legs. And so in ticks, both the male and the female tick is blood feeding in the larvae and nymph and adult life stage. And then what you can see on this person's finger is obviously there's a size differential between adult ticks and larval and nymphal ticks. And often it's believed that larval and nymphal ticks of many species of ticks are very tiny and very difficult to detect on our bodies. And because of that, um, it's likely that nymphal ticks are the ones that spread the most disease to people, and larval and nymphal ticks are actually very difficult to detect. And so most of the time, people, when they're submitting ticks for identification, are actually submitting adult ticks life stages because they're easier to notice. Here in California, which is it's interesting, we really, I'm going to say this, and people can put in the chat, well, hey, I know another tick or I know another tick, but after over 20 years here collecting ticks, there's basically 4 ticks that we collect in Southern California and actually even all the way up into Northern California. And you might say, well, what about the rabbit tick? Yeah, we get rabbit ticks sometimes. Or what about, well, I would say rabbit ticks are definitely the one tick not on this slide that we would collect. Every once in a while, we'll get some various exodes from natural areas, but for the most part, we've got 4 ticks in California as of today that I'm aware of. And for the remainder of the presentation, I'm kind of just grouping them in this way, which is you got your native ticks, and native ticks are ticks that live in natural areas, and then you're going to have urban ticks. And the urban tick is the brown dog tick. And that's really what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. But first, I wanted to compare and contrast a little bit about these native ticks as compared to brown dog ticks. And so native ticks are ticks that live in dense woodlands, chaparral, mixed forest, coastal sage scrub, conifer evergreen forest. Um, those are most people in Orange County, most of the 3.2 million of us do not live anywhere near or adjacent to these native lands. And so majority of the population in this county visits native lands to do recreational activities and has exposures to ticks during recreational activities for the native ticks. And so really it's only the brown dog tick that's a tick that's going to be in someone's home. And native ticks, they can be collected in many environments, beaches, mountains, picnic tables, from ticks directly questing. There's definitely opportunities for Californians to encounter the native ticks and potentially be impacted by native ticks. But one thing about the native ticks, and for those of you who are on the East Coast or even in the Southeast, we just do not have the high abundance of ticks in California like you experience. I'm not exactly sure why. However, I can say that at least for the Western black-legged tick, Ixodes pacificus, the life cycle of this tick is going to take, it's going to be occurring over multiple years. And so it has this longer life cycle. Many of the there's not really control programs for native ticks. Majority, at least in California, it's related to vegetation trimming of trails to prevent people from coming in contact with vegetation. So we're just not seeing environments with this high abundance of native ticks. And perhaps it could be because of their long life cycles, which require 3 hosts as well. But the 3 hosts that the native ticks are feeding on, they can switch between like a bird, a small rodent, and then they end up on larger animals like deer. That's just not the same as the life cycle of the brown dog tick. And the California Department of Public Health has a lot of great resources and visual aids to understand the ticks that are found in California and potential diseases that they may carry. And for the purpose of this presentation today and brown dog ticks, I'm really only going to be focusing on Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And I know people are like, well, what about Ehrlichia or anaplasmosis? And it's just not been, those diseases are not detected with a high frequency at all and are not considered to be spread by brown dog ticks in California by the California Department of Public Health, according to this chart. So I'm sure there's other examples where things can be different, but it's just another example of in California, the ticks do not have these higher prevalences of anaplasmosis and ehrlichiosis. And so looking at our native ticks, one thing we can see is that they're colorful. This is Dermacentor similis, the American dog tick. I know they look really large here on the screen, but you can see that they have different colors and different sizes as well. Same thing with Dermacentor occidentalis, the Pacific Coast tick. They seem to have a differentiation in color on their bodies and their legs. Ixodes pacificus would be one of the smaller ticks that we have here as compared to Dermacentor, but you can also see, there's a difference in color on these 2 ticks. And that varies very much when you're dealing with brown dog ticks. Brown dog ticks, at least in fielding phone calls from the public and doing IDs, they're uniformly a brown color. And so that's one way. Another way, when I'm asking people if they're saying that they're having ticks and that they do not go hiking, they do not go to natural areas, that they only see the ticks in their backyard or potentially at a park or around their home or neighborhood, that helps us also determine, hey, this could actually be the brown dog tick. And it's worth noting that look at this distribution. If you go on CDC's webpage and you start clicking into the different ticks of the United States, you'll find that There's only one tick. It's the brown dog tick, which can be found in all 50 states, although Hawaii and Alaska are not noted here, across the United States. And that's because brown dog ticks can complete their entire life cycle indoors. And that's really a huge difference between native ticks, which would not be able to complete their life cycles indoors, and the brown dog tick, which can be found in, as I mentioned, all 50 states of the United States. And I'm going to now spend a moment here looking at some images taken from the tourist paper of, on the top left, we're looking at a larval brown dog tick. Image B, top right, is a nymph, and then the adult male and female on the bottom left and right. And then I like the image that University of Florida uses here on the right, which shows um, the nymph tick, which looks so much larger than the tiny little larval ticks. And I know, at least in California, something that's different than the East Coast and Southeast is we almost no public health agency in California regularly collects nymph or larval ticks of our native ticks. And in all of the responses I've been involved with from brown dog ticks, we've only ever encountered adult life stages as well. I'm not sure about that, why that would be, but I definitely know for native ticks, at least in California, the larvae and nymphal stages are likely in Southern California to be most active in the summer months. Those are months when our agencies are focusing primarily on mosquito control, and we're not actively flagging for ticks. But it's kind of like the holy grail, which is to collect larval or nymphal ticks of any of the species in California. Much different than the East Coast. I do want to just show some pictures of the mouth part here. Between, on the left is an example of an exotic tick, and on the right is the Rhipicephalus sanguineus, the brown dog tick mouth parts. And the authors of these papers kind of talk about how the mouth parts are much shorter and stubbier in the Rhipicephalus ticks. And it's interesting, they also say that when the brown dog ticks are pulled out or removed from dogs, one thing you'll notice is they're often removed with like a chunk of skin still stuck in their mouth part. And that's just because they're using a little bit tighter of a grip and skin is coming out when you pull them. And that could be related to the fact they have a shorter hypostome and mouth part in general. But one thing that's interesting too is many people just think when encountering brown dog ticks for the first time that they're dealing with multiple species. And that could be because, a female engorged tick who is able to lay 4,000 to 7,000 eggs per clutch. So that's a lot. If you only have one, if you take your dog to the groomer and it comes back with one female tick on it, and then 6 months later, you've got 4,000 to 7,000 adult ticks crawling around your home. Perhaps you didn't notice, but you can see that people oftentimes will not believe it's ticks because perhaps they found a larger tick and then they found maybe a smaller tick and then some adult ticks. So the brown dog tick life cycle is certainly less complicated than native tick life cycles. Brown dog ticks really they're a three-host tick, meaning they require a blood meal to molt between each of their life stages, but they're most likely to receive all of those blood meals from a single source, which is dogs. And that means they can potentially develop and spend their entire life indoors. But what I think what's interesting in looking at the life cycle is on the life cycle, it's like, oh, wow, these ticks are constantly biting the dogs. They're coming off, biting the dogs. But in reality, the brown dog ticks spend most of their life off the host in the environment, digesting the blood meal, then shedding their skin, then going out to find another source to find the dog again for another blood meal. And so I think it's important to note that most of the time the ticks are off of the dogs. And so when you see a dog with like a lot of ticks on the body itself, you can imagine there must be quite a few more ticks actually left in the environment. Another thing to note about this life cycle is It can go really fast. So there's reports of up to 4 generations per year in the American Southwest, and that's because we have warm temperatures here. And when you have stray dogs present or a food source and the dogs are returning to sleep in the same area at night, you can get high abundance of these ticks. But I also want the group to know probably the most insane part of brown dog ticks is in any of the life stages, whether it be larvae, nymphs, or adult, the tick themselves, if there is no food present or no host present for blood meal, they can enter a diapause or quiescent state. Each of those life stages, it can last 3 to 5 years if necessary. So a lot of people say, how long is a tick life cycle? And the answer is supposed to be, if resources are abundant, it can go very quickly. But if resources are not abundant, they can slow down their life cycle and wait till a resource becomes available again. And so although brown dog ticks can achieve 3 to 4 generations per year, they can also take a break and diapause in the environment and then come out years later when food is present, which makes them incredibly difficult to control in a backyard environment with lots of cracks and crevices. And I think what's interesting to learn about when ticks feed on animals and when they drop off is a lot of research has shown that tick nymphs and larvae are going to drop off during the daytime, but the adult gravid female ticks are going to detach during the nighttime in the area where near the dogs are sleeping. And so I think it's important to note that if you're attempting to achieve control of brown dog ticks, identifying areas where animals are sleeping or spending significant amounts of time at rest are important because those are the areas where the female gravid ticks and potentially the largest number of larval ticks will be present. And so we can see here that stray dogs can become heavily infested with these ticks, and the infestation of the ticks is normally in areas which are not easily groomed, like ears, between toes, and between the folds of the legs. In outdoor environments, as I mentioned, the ticks can hide and then go dormant, or they can look for microclimates with adequate relative humidity for them to digest blood meals and continue their lives and development. And so these are just some examples of ticks that are hiding or ticks that are questing. And that's also what's kind of interesting about brown dog ticks. It's our only tick here in California, our only hard tick in California that actively will take off in search for a meal and potentially can travel fairly long distances. But I say fairly long distances, but they're small ticks. I mean, over multiple backyards. Here in Southern California, we have about 10 properties per acre, and it's reasonable. We've seen them move 2, 3, 4 properties over, and then sometimes ticks will detach during walks of the animals, and so you can also find ticks in the environment through the ticks themselves feeding and then falling off. And thank you to Marco Metzger from California Department of Public Health for sharing some of these pictures of questing brown dog ticks in a residential backyard in Riverside County. Just another example of ticks questing on the dog food bowl and also on the dog water bowl, waiting to encounter a dog and take another blood meal. And something that's been changing in the American Southwest, at least over the last, well, it's been going on for over 20 years now, but certainly within the last year, has been CDC issued a local health alert, a LAHON, regarding severe and fatal confirmed Rocky Mountain spotted fever among people with recent travel to Tecate, Mexico. And Tecate, Mexico is almost directly adjacent to the United States border. Basically, it's adjacent to the US border, and adjacent to the US border, of course, there's a fence, but as you know, animals, other things can cross very easily back and forth between the fence. And then what's also interesting is that animal welfare groups often travel from the United States to Mexico to pick up dogs, to bring them back to the United States, to hopefully adopt them out. And it's through these main methods of people bringing their pets or animals across the border, and then also people adopting animals and bringing them into the United States, that brown dog ticks prevalence has really increased in the Southwest over the last years here. And so much so that many holiday in 2023, this local health action alert went out in December, and many local school districts were provided this alert to the students, letting them know if they're going to be visiting relatives in northern Mexico to be able to check themselves for the presence of these ticks. And that's important because in a 6-month time period in California, at least 5 people had been admitted to hospitals after returning from traveling in Tecate, Mexico, and having exposure to brown dog ticks. And CDC has a lot of really great, people like to ask questions like, well, what is Rocky Mountain spotted fever? Like, how bad is it? And of course, I'm not a doctor, I am an entomologist, but CDC posted these physician cards, which contain some interesting information. They say the early signs and symptoms are fever, headache, body aches, tired, nonspecific. That sounds like anything, really. And later signs of illness could include a petechial rash, multi-organ failure, septic shock, encephalitis, and people go quickly between these early symptoms and potential fatality. And so the rash occurs in approximately 90% of cases, but it takes anywhere for 2 to 4 days after the person's really feeling badly for this rash to develop. And of note for this audience in particular is 60% of people don't even know they were bit by a tick. How could that be, really? Especially you got to think about how if they're bit by a nymphal tick or a larval tick, potentially they wouldn't notice them. And that's possibly it. But this is something we even see with mosquito-borne illness. More than half of people who get West Nile virus have no recollection of a mosquito bite. And I think this also points out that all of us react differently to tick bites. And so some people may be non-reactors, and perhaps if they're not reacting to the tick bite, they would have no idea that a tick had bit them and fed on them. And the treatment for Rocky Mountain spotted fever is doxycycline, both for children and adults. I think one of the main issues is that the treatment needs to occur in the first days of illness in order for it to be incredibly effective. And if treatment is not received, if someone doesn't go to the hospital or seek medical attention in a timely fashion, there's evidence that it can get a lot worse very quickly. And this is just some examples of that petechial rash that's posted from CDC. And the rash is interesting in that it also will appear on the hands and the soles of the feet. And there's been a lot of work that's been looking at fatal Rocky Mountain spotted fever along the US Mexico border. And I think one of the reasons why all this work has been done is because, and I'm not focusing on this part in my presentation today, which is that there's good information about Rocky Mountain spotted fever being transmitted by native ticks in other areas of the United States. But Rocky Mountain spotted fever had largely been absent from the American Southwest. And then what was reported epidemiologically was a large increase in cases and an association with brown dog ticks and stray dogs on tribal lands and Native American reservations. And through analysis, there's been a lot of outreach and education campaigns to doctors in Arizona, Nevada, California, and New Mexico about how providing doxycycline earlier in illness can potentially prevent premature death and save millions of dollars from disability. CDC on their webpage provides us these epidemiologic graphs of this would be the number of reported cases of spotted fever rickettsiosis, and they give a disclaimer on their webpage and say all the spotted fever rickettsiosis are Rocky Mountain spotted fever. But what you'll see is there was a huge drop off in reporting of cases post 2020. And so there was cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever were increasing, and then following 2020, they were decreasing. CDC provides some information about why that would be occurring. But what is also interesting is the reported incidence of spotted fever group or of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in the United States from 1920 to 2017. And what we can see is if the case fatality rate is in blue here is you can see like until the widespread use of antibiotics, there was a much higher case fatality rate, almost 20%. And then after the introduction and the use of antibiotics, case fatality rate has fallen to below 5% and currently is, less than 1 to 3%. But still, that's a large, fairly high case fatality rate, and it's something that people need to be aware of so they can seek treatment. And then in terms of the seasonality, looking from 2018 to 2022, no surprise here, the majority number of this is the Rocky Mountain spotted fever cases by month, and with the peak of cases being June, but continuing year round, and they can continue year round because, as we already know, brown dog ticks can reproduce inside and do not need to reproduce outdoors. And the incidence of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in the United States in 2022 really shows how it's the north central, as well as the southwest that have been the heavily impacted by cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And I think this graph's probably the most interesting to me of the epidemiologic data, which is that, this is the incidence rate per population group. And you can see that as the population ages, the incidence rates get higher. So, Americans 60 to 75 seem to be most highly impacted. And could that be because people in that age category have a hard time seeing small things and potentially are not detecting the ticks and removing them from their body in a timely manner? And I just want to state to the group that the proliferation of brown dog ticks across Southern California and the relationship between dogs being taken from one area and adopted in another area, brought from Mexico into Southern California, definitely has increased brown dog tick prevalence in the area. And it's something that a lot of like dog owners just are not aware of. They adopt the dog, they don't really get in the ears, they believe that these sanctuaries have checked the dogs out, but ticks are small and, even well-minded people may miss one from time to time. And so we've definitely seen, at least in terms of people reporting and then what we've seen in the field, that the incidence increases after people adopt animals from certain animal sanctuaries. With Best Friends Animal Sanctuary, which operates primarily out of the American Southwest, is really moving a lot of dogs from northern Mexico to areas of the US where they can be adopted, unintentionally bring in the ticks. And so, although we're presented and left with many perceivable strategies for flea or tick prevention, it really does come down to reducing flea and tick density and educating people about modifying their own behavior to reduce exposures to fleas and ticks. And one of the reasons why this disease is challenging is because there is no topical flea or tick control products which you can put on wildlife like possums, skunks, squirrels, feral cats, all of which can, brown dog ticks prefer dogs, but they can also be on wildlife. And how we conduct surveillance for brown dog ticks, this is me conducting surveillance for native ticks in the environment using a traditional flag. We do flagging for brown dog ticks. Sometimes we do white sock tests. We also can remove ticks directly from animals. Here at the Mosquito and Vector Control District, we do have an in-house microbiology and PCR lab staffed by a PhD scientist. Shout out to Dr. Daisy Rangel, our microbiologist, who then is able to test these ticks for the presence of Rocky Mountain spotted fever or causative agents of flea-borne typhus. Now, I know on the East Coast and in the Southeast, sometimes it's, according to CDC guidelines, you put on a Tyvek suit before you go out and do flagging. We can do that here, although since the abundance is lower, it's not a required part of our protocol, but you can see that even with a lot of people out conducting surveillance, oftentimes our tick counts are very low. But we do have one record, and that record comes from this brief story I'm going to share in the next few minutes here about the most brown dog ticks we've ever collected at a residential property and off of 300 square feet of grass. Our agency was contacted by a local public works department. You can see behind me in this photo is that telephone pole. A worker was on a different residential property, not the one I'm standing on, which was overgrown, had to get into the back, had to conduct some maintenance on this power pole, climbs all the way up the power pole to hang up various lines, conduct maintenance, and notices that his uniform is covered in a bunch of crawling bugs. And immediately became concerned, came right down from the pole, drove over to the local agricultural office. We are Mosquito Control. Agriculture is a separate department, separate office. They then told this person to bring it to our agency. We took a look at it, identified them as brown dog ticks, then went out the next day to see, what could be going on. Why would this man be covered in ticks? It was a strange story. Of course, we believed him, but this just doesn't happen that often. And so on arriving at the residential property, we were not granted access to the property where this worker encountered the large number of ticks. The property was vacant and it would require a warrant to access the backyard. So instead, we contacted adjacent properties to what we would call the index property, and we were granted access to one 300-foot square patch of grass. And within 30 minutes, I was able to collect 862 adult brown dog ticks. And so this is just a huge burden of ticks on a very small amount of grass in a sea of urban North Orange County. And so in this case, we knew from the utility worker that there were ticks in the neighborhood. On going out to the neighborhood, we were able to visually observe ticks on 2 properties. And then we started to receive people start coming out to be like, hey, are you here for the ticks or what's going on? And we could tell that there were more properties that were actually impacted by the presence of the ticks. But of course, without a warrant, public health agencies have to receive permission from property owners to access the private property. So we wanted to make an attempt to figure out why brown dog ticks were so prevalent in this neighborhood, and also what the agency could do to provide control. We conducted a notification after going to the area and trying to determine a target area for the intervention. What we did next is we developed some notification and outreach materials just explaining what brown dog ticks are, what their size is, what the recommendation is in order to how to get rid of them. And as part of that notice, we provided an education meeting, and we also provided an opportunity to distribute topical flea control medication to residences with cats or dogs within the treatment or the target area. We also said that we would send staff to conduct a application of a residual insecticide if larval, adult, nymphal fleas or ticks were found on the property, and we would provide that service free of charge. So as you can see, this is a very small patch of grass that's outlined. The red starred home was the vacant home under foreclosure. It ended up taking us over 6 weeks to access that backyard. We did not need to achieve a warrant, but the warrant process can also be long for these types of inspection or abatement warrants. And because we couldn't access that index house, what we think happened is that the ticks moved from that house to areas of high humidity to wait it out. And so we were able to find brown dog ticks on 3 properties, 2 front yards and 1 backyard. But overall, 7 properties reported to us that there were ticks present, although we were not able to conduct surveillance at the time that we were there. And so we knew that this was a large amount of ticks, and we knew that we needed to distribute the material. And what I think is always interesting is that we're there, we're knocking on doors, we're trying to hand out free material, but people feel very protective. They don't want to admit that their animals have the ticks, they feel that that would maybe we'd look down on them. And so because of that, we always give them an option to call in later and request additional medication. We then notified our local animal control agencies that there was an issue, potentially there were stray animals, and we asked them to follow up at this neighborhood as well. And, we asked our local animal cares to please enforce their local jurisdictional animal ownership limits. Oftentimes, these neighborhoods have feeders. These are people who feed large colonies of stray cats, and there's a lot of pet food out there, and there may even need to be some animal removal. As a vector control agency, we don't remove animals. We really are there primarily for arthropods. And so we drew, oftentimes in public health, there's two target areas, if you will. There's a notification target area where all of the homes within this area can be notified through signage or door hangers about the presence of ticks in the neighborhood. And then in a smaller subset of the area, we offer additional services like res residual tick control applications of pesticides and whatnot. So these, they're challenging. I can't really say we got great control in the neighborhood, but I can say this. We've never received a call from the 7 homes that we treated their pets. We told them we would provide free tick and flea control medication for a year, and we were not called back again. And so we like to believe that perhaps providing this and topical tick medication and also residual services reduce the tick burden. Because if you live next to someone who has their dogs chained up outside and the dogs are covered in ticks, if they don't correct that, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to continue to reinfest the entire neighborhood. And so future directions, we've always are analyzing what's a good size area for a target area for either a notification or an area-wide response. And of course, refinement of response triggers, obviously 800 ticks on a small area, that's a lot of ticks. But what if there was one tick there? Would the agency, would we be like, nah, that, maybe that doesn't meet the trigger of doing an area-wide intervention? And then in general, our district, we are here to say we'd like to promote the development of topical or feed-through flea or tick control formulations, which can be used on wildlife and feral cats to target both fleas and ticks. So I'd like to just acknowledge CDPH, VBDS section, the OC Vector Lab. Hey guys, the communications and operations team, our previous colleague James Campbell, who's passed on, and Vector Coordinator John Drake for always being game to try new control methods. And at this point, I can take any questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. If folks want to unmute or throw a question in the chat, feel free to do so.
I also want to mention one thing before I forget. Brown dog ticks are not known to be associated with the alpha-gal syndrome.
Nice. Yeah, and I know you said you had some resources, Laura. I can send that,
Oh
share
yeah.
that in our base camp group as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Let me get those
so
for
you
you.
can always send those over to me, and I can share those.
I will send those to you after the meeting today. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, one more call for questions. Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap this up. Um, I will share those resources with you all through Basecamp as well.
This is Dawn Krueger. Oh, sorry, University of Arizona. As I unplug everything, I just wondered. You were helpful, of course, Laura, that your interventions were crashing populations. I wonder, is there no ability to do a more sort of scientific approach as far as evaluating? Because it just seems like you have this ideal situation here where you could gather some operational data.
Yeah, I'm just in all seriousness here. 80% of our workload is normally mosquitoes. And so what happens is because we have not detected Rocky Mountain spotted fever in the brown dog ticks yet, they're clearly a nuisance, but we've never actually detected disease in Orange County in the tick yet.
Okay.
Because of that, they fall to a lower response level. And so most of what that means is once we go to the neighborhood, we collect the ticks, we conduct the intervention, all the ticks test negative, that's going to immediately score this to a lower level. And so this is a constant issue here at Vector Control is most of the time we refocus on another issue of a higher priority and we don't go back to follow up on the issue that we've already dealt with. And I would love to someday be able to do something like that. I
Yeah,
know our
I
agency
bet.
strives to do that for
Yeah,
mosquito control as well, but we just have to assume that if with signs being up in the neighborhood for over 6 months, if anyone would have seen anything, they would have called us. I mean, that's an assumption, of
right.
course.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree, especially in some of these neighborhoods that are they're perfect to conduct more studies on knowledge and behaviors and if that affects change. But unfortunately, we don't have the resources to do it.
Thank you. One quick follow-up, if I can, Josie, and that's just what are you dispensing to homeowners
Yeah,
for the on-dog treatment?
we dispense whatever is the cheapest normally. We purchase each year lots of all of the flea and tick medication that is available over the counter. So it has to be
Okay.
OTC. We ask the resident to sign a waiver that says they know this product is available to them over the counter. We're not choosing pyrethroids, but we are choosing products and we go out with a big old bag and or sometimes we set up in a community center and we just ask that the residents, if the community we're in has an animal ownership limit. So for instance, if we're in the city of Anaheim and they say you can only have 5 dogs, we're going to give out the official amount that's allowed to the residents, but we will be able to provide all the different sizes of the medications. We have small, large, puppy, all that.
Thank you so
the
much.
I will say the last few years I believe we used we used a trade, we purchased it from 1-800 Pet Meds. So that's how we purchase it.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, if there are no more questions, we can go ahead and lock off. Just one quick reminder, I am going to share this post quiz poll really quick. And then, yeah, one quick reminder, our last webinar for this funding cycle will be February 12th at 1 o'clock Central Time. I'll post in Base Camp for that reminder as well. Yeah, so folks could do that quiz or poll question really quick before they hop off. That would be great. And just big thank you to Laura for presenting. This was a great talk. Really, really cool stuff. So super appreciate
Thank
you
you.
being on today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Perfect. And you are free to go. All right. Thanks everyone for joining.